Welcome back. Today we will talk about speech production by infants, and this is the last lecture of this module. So, in terms of speech production, vocal stages of vocalization, why do we call them vocalization? Because in the initial stages children do not really speak, so to say. They do not really have words or sentences. So, it starts with some vocalization going through various kinds of stages, as you can see. So, I have quoted this from one particular study. So, 0 to 1 month there is this reflexive uncontrolled vocalization such as crying, burping and coughing. So, these are the initial stages of initial sounds and initial vocalizations, which do not really have any neither have any meaning as such. I mean, meaning as in they have they indicate something, they have indexical meaning, but they are not really sounds or words as such. They are primarily reflexive and uncontrolled in that sense, right. So, in the beginning, then 2 to 3 months there is the cooing stage and mostly made up of vowel sounds like various kinds of vowels in a continuous stream. That is the first. The second stage. Third stage will be 4 to 6 months, when they will be squealing, growling, and there are various kinds of exploring new sounds. So, this is where consonants start to appear, and this is where they will start to explore new sounds and try to produce them. And then there will be the 7 to 9 months, where the canonical babbling stage starts, using the same syllables repeatedly, like ba ba ba, like this. So, this is the babbling stage. So, this there is this is the stage where syllables begin to appear, and then 10 to 12 months variegated babbling, and then sounds more like adult speech with varying sound, and so on and so forth, something like this. So, varying sounds and syllables, they will be put together and they will almost sound like words, almost sound like a meaningful utterance, appearing words. So, these are the stages. Now, while they are trying to speak, while they are trying to imitate or trying to be a speaker of the language in the community, there are these various kinds of stages. So, when in the beginning stages there is those just some meaningless sounds, but when some semblance of words appear, these are things that are very common. To quote Barbara Last, so sounds are sometimes omitted. So, this broke will be pronounced as boke. Sounds are substituted for each other. So, rabbit will be called wabbit. Sounds within a word gets assimilated. So, doggy becomes goggy. So, this part comes here. So, d gets replaced, gets replaced with ga, and so on. Then repeating syllables within words. So, tummy will be said as tum tum, bottle, baba, and so on. So, these are some signs of initial production, speech production of children, more or less that is common across the world, various languages. So, why does it happen? Why do not children start speaking just like that? The reasons are many. So, the primary question here, however, is the reasons we will get to in a minute, but the primary question here is that we have already seen that children can perceive sound very well in the beginning, starting with a few days old to few months old, and eventually they can really figure out between very fine tuned differences. So, sounds distinguished from familiar to unfamiliar language, between mother's language, other's language, various kinds of differentiation of sounds, so voicing, aspiration, so on and so forth. So, they have a very sophisticated speech perception ability. Now, this is not matched by their ability to produce the same sounds or other sounds. So, there is a mismatch that happens between the speech perception and speech production. That is one of the most interesting thing about speech production among children. Now, the question is, why is it, why does it happen? Children of course wants to speak, they want to speak because that is what we see from the very beginning. They start vocalizing and they try to say something, but it does not really happen. One of the reasons that have been put forward is the primary reason, which is articulatory constraints. What does articulatory constraint mean? That remember we talked about the specific kind of vocal tract that humans have, the specific kind of larynx that we have, the kind of the muscles that we have, all of that help us. So, in children, in very small children, in infants, even though they understand things as in their brain understands them, but the articulatory apparatus is not yet fully equipped to produce the same sounds that they perceive. That is the difference. So, the vocal tract is the wrong shape in the beginning in the newborn babies. So, newborn babies have a shorter vocal tract than the adults, and the larynx also is placed higher like other primates, higher primates. Our larynx starts to descend only at the in some time in the first years, a little few months into the well into the few months of the child's life, around 3 months or 4 months of age, the larynx starts to lower. So, that is when the vocal tract appears similar to the adult vocal tract. So, that is one problem. Second problem is that the tongue is larger in comparison with a child's head and other structures. The tongue is much larger than necessary. So, as a result of which the tongue muscles are also not well adapted. This is not well fully developed and well adapted for those subtle movements that are necessary for creating the speech sounds. So, as a result vocalizing happens, but not producing speech sounds. So, speech sounds are we need far more fine tuning, far more adept handling than the vocalization. So, that is why we see vocalization in the very beginning, but eventually that gets sharpened to speech sounds. So, as the larynx gets lowered, the tongue muscles get fine tuned and so on. So, then the articulatory constraints will slowly the child will overcome. So, physiological changes throughout the first year of life finally makes the child start speaking. Also, they go through the pre-linguistic vocal developments during this time, the stages of which are largely similar across the languages. So, pre-vocalic changes as well as the physiological changes that will take care of the child's ability. So, development of speech sounds is dependent upon also the universal sequence of maturation. So, on the one hand you have the articulatory constraint, on the other hand there is something called universal constraint, which was proposed by Jacobson way back in 1941, followed up in 1968. So, the idea here is that there is a kind of a constraint which is universal across the world's languages depending on the stages of maturation. So, there is an inventory, universal inventory of distinctive features which is said to underlie all possible phonemes of all the languages, a set of distinctive features which is at the basis of all the phonological differences, and that is, and there we have a sequence which is universal. So, as per Jacobson, these features are organized in an implicational hierarchy. This hierarchy arranges features in a stratified manner, starting at the most common ones to the rare ones. So, the world's languages will have some set of contrasts, let us say phonological contrasts that are most common across all languages. For example, let us say the ba ma construct, the difference, the sound ba versus ma is more common compared to some other constructs which are specific to certain languages. So, if that is the case, the most common features are at the highest level, and then the hierarchically the lower ones will be the ones that are less common. So, this is how he puts it. The hierarchy looks somewhat like this. So, the most common ones, the most common sounds are called the unmarked sounds, and these are the sounds that are learned first. And on the lower end of the spectrum, you have the less common sounds which he calls marked sounds. Those marked sounds will be learned later. So, the technically the unmarked sounds are the universal sounds and the marked ones are language specific sounds. So, some sounds are, for example, we talked about if you recall, we talked about the click sounds that is present in some South African languages. So, now that could be a contrast that is not very common. So, it could be a marked contrast as opposed to the pa ba kind of a construct. So, another important feature about this theory is that universal constant theory is that they do not infants do not really acquire speech sounds, they acquire sounds. So, they acquire a set of contrasting sounds rather than contrasting speech sounds. So, they need a set to learn. To begin with, they need a contrasting set, that the pa ba contrast, for example, they need a contrast. So, they are able to contrast between the two sounds, whether they are part of the language or not, that comes later. In the beginning, at the stage that we are looking at, infants simply distinguish between two sounds based on their properties, which are, if they are universal, they will be learned first, if they are language specific, they will be learnt later. That is the gist. So, the contrasts that are common will be learned first, and the other ones will be learned later. Now, there is also a genetic predisposition that is part of this theory. The idea here is that developmental stages for infants are genetically programmed and are universal. So, the stages of development we have seen with Piaget and others also, that the developmental stages are, we are genetically coded to develop in a particular pattern. So, this is as a result of which it is common to see infants learning or acquiring the sounds in the same sequence as well. Because if we are genetically predisposed to have particular stages of development in terms of mental development and language development, so then it is understandable that sounds will also have, acquiring sounds will also have the a sequence. For example, bilabial stops are a set found in early speech production across English, Japanese and Swedish by this particular study carried out in 1991. Bilabial stops like pa ba contrast that I was talking about. Not only that, the errors are universal too according to this theory. So, this theory predicts similar kind of errors across languages. And this also for example, in case of Serbian, Swedish, German, French and English, a large variety of languages, children typically will replace ka, ga will be replaced by ta. So, these are the velar sounds are more often than not replaced by a dental sound in many of the world's languages. So, probably this is easier to pronounce compared to the velar sounds. Similarly, there is an example given by last 2006, the sound ka ka in Serbian becomes tata. In case of German also the same thing is seen. So, because this kind of sounds are probably difficult. So, the errors happen across language in the same pattern. That is what the theory predicted, and this is what has been supported by some findings. However, we also have some contradictory findings. Some languages do not seem to follow the same kind of maturational stage that this theory proposes. Some cases in some languages they follow a language specific pattern. For example, labials are less common in Japanese and Swedish than English and French. Bilabial stops are less common in Japanese and Swedish, but it is more common in English and French. So, similarly sounds like and these are common among young Quiche Mayan speakers in Guatemala, though English learners acquire these quite late. Now, this is not obviously because this contrast or this kind of sounds are certainly not universal, but these children do learn it in the beginning. English learners do not learn it till quite late. So, this is not hence it does not hold universally, that is the idea here. So, similarly Bulgarian, Estonian, Swedish children learn to produce v sound earlier than the English children. So, what these findings primarily point towards is that there is probably not a universal pattern that holds for all languages in terms of how children learn to utter certain kinds of sounds. Universal theory proposes that there will be a universal pattern, but there are these contradictions. Now, there are various hypotheses, various theories as to why this kind of things happen. These theories try to take into account the various kinds of differences or various kinds of patterns that we see in terms of infant speech production. One of the more well known ones is called mushy mouth, mushy ear hypothesis that by Last. Again this idea is that the mispronunciation happens because of misperception. Mushy ear as in they do not hear it properly. So, if they do not hear it properly, the pronunciation also get affected. So, if you hear wrong pronunciation, you will utter it in a wrong way. So, the idea here is that the infants often pronounce words wrong because they do not perceive it correctly. Now, this is contradictory because we have seen till now we have seen that children actually perceive sounds with a lot of sophistication even at the very early age, but the point that this theory talks about is that identifying sounds in isolation is one thing, identifying them in a continuous speech and then producing it is a different thing. Children typically, infants typically, typically developing children will hear those sounds not in isolation, but embedded in a continuous speech. So, as a result of which they may actually do not perceive them differently. This is one example of one such study. They created minimal pairs using non-word nonsense words. So, this B D minimal pair, the infants were less than 17 months old. This is how they had. So, there was a nonsense word paired with a picture which is supposed to be the meaning of that. So, B this looks like a crown, but for now just ignore that this is a crown. This is these were put together. So, when they heard the sound the word B, they saw this, when they heard this they saw this. So, this is of course, the child does not know either crown or a chemical composition. So, for them this is something new. So, this is how new words, nonsense words and new objects were paired. In the familiarization phase, they hear the sounds and see the corresponding picture. In the test phase, the combination is reversed. So, when they saw this in the familiarization phase, in the test phase this will be deferred. So, in the test phase this will be shown with respect to this sound and vice versa. So, this is in the test phase, but in the familiarization phase they will be seen, they will see it as it is. What they the dependent variable here was longer time to look at the picture. So, the idea in the test phase was the combination, because it is reversed, to check if they identify the change. Now, what they found out was at 14 months infants could distinguish between sounds that were totally different like leaf and neem, but not B and D. They could not distinguish. There are things that are completely different, meaning they are not minimal pairs. These two are minimal pairs, because there is only one change here, the first sound changes. So, that is why it is a minimal pair. So, children could, the infants could distinguish between the non-minimal pairs, but minimal pair they could not distinguish. After 17 months of age, they could differentiate the minimal pairs as well. So, this suggests that misperception could be one reason between for mispronunciation, because till then they are not able to perceive it correctly. There is this other very well known study on the fish, this is called the fish phenomenon. This is a conversation between an adult and a child. The child says there is a fish in the pail. So, adult says there is a fish in the pail. Adult is imitating the child's pronunciation of the word fish. The child is pronouncing fish as fish, and the father also, father or mother, whoever was there, is also pronouncing the way the child was pronouncing. So, the child does not agree, no, not fish, fish, she stresses it, but pronounces the same way. Similarly, again adult, is this your fish? No, my fish. She continued to reject the adult's pronunciation till he said the following, this is your fish. Yes, my fish. So, what is happening here is that mispronunciation does not mislead her to misperceive. She is pronouncing it as fish, but she refuses to acknowledge the adult's pronunciation as a proper pronunciation. The adults should be pronouncing it as fish. So, only when the adult pronounces it as fish, the child agrees, yes, but then they cannot. So, the understanding, the gap between the understanding and pronunciation that this theory proposes does not hold here, because the child perfectly understands that it should be this is how it is perceived as fish, but the child is not able to pronounce. There are many other examples of such cases. For example, the word jump, the child is not able to say jump, but when the father says jump, then child says only papa can say mama, papa, I forgot, can say dump, dup. So, the child is not able to say jump and says dup instead, and says that the only parents can say that. So, they understand, the perception is there in place, but pronunciation is not. So, there is a mismatch. So, examples like this show that they perceive the difference, but are not yet able to produce the sounds correctly. So, it could be a matter of articulatory constraints, not exactly constraint of perception, but a constraint of articulation. But then we have this, is it only articulation problem? To counter this, we can talk about this example. Now, this is a very interesting, pretty old study, but interesting nonetheless. So, in this case, the child deforms the word puddle, but produces puzzle as puddle. Okay. So, the when they have to, so this is the target word, the child produces for puddle, the child says puggle, but when the target word is puzzle, then the child says puddle. So, it is not that child is not able to produce the puddle sound, they can, but somehow it does not happen when it is supposed to be, but they are producing the same sound in case of puzzle. So, the idea here is that the articulatory constraint probably is not the problem. What is the problem then? There are, we do not know what is the problem, there are many theories that have been proposed, but because of lack of time we will not be going there in detail. Now, there are other kinds of things as well, there is something called regression. Regression talks about the child starts with the proper pronunciation, then they regress into they do not pronounce it properly, there is a regression on their capacity, and then they eventually get back. So, this is one particular study, this is well known as Leopold's Hildegard. So, they start 10 to 16 months she could pronounce the word pretty, at 18 months it went to become biddy, and then again 18 plus months it came back to pretty. So, this kind of things also happen, there are all kinds of possibilities that are there in terms of the pronunciation. So, there are many theories, another theory. So, mushy mouth, mushy ear theory does not always hold, and then now we come to another theory called template theory. This theory tries to explain infant speech production in terms of a task. So, there is a template that the child develops, and then whatever they hear they try to figure it out within the template, and whenever the template does not match or they try to extend the template, that is when we see the errors. This is what the template theory primarily says. So, the sound meaning mapping needs articulatory finesse not available to the child. So, what the child does, this is going against the earlier theory where we say that the word, probably the word and the meaning gets mapped together, and that is what the child figures out. Here the theory says that the word meaning mapping, the sound and meaning mapping probably is not yet available. So, what they do is they resort to creating word template, right. Word templates are well practiced word patterns that the child already has learnt. In the beginning stage of their life, they have learnt a few words, they have practiced it well enough, they have heard it an adequate number of times, as a result of which there is a pattern, there is a template that is created, which is based on probably sounds. While learning new words, this template gets extended, and that is when the errors take place. So, for example, if trochaic stress pattern is the template that the child has achieved, for example, take the case of English children, if they have heard a lot of words with trochaic pattern, then they will take that pattern as the word template. So, all words should be following this particular template. Now, if they have a new word that does not follow that pattern, then they will make an error in their production. That is the that is one of the possibilities. Similarly, if a vowel followed by the sha fricative pattern is learnt, it can be used to produce multiple words like fish, dish, fetch and waste, etc. So, followed by the child probably pronounces them as waste, fish and like that. So, this was this comes from a study carried out by I think by Berman 1977. So, they talked about this particular child who seems to have figured out that a vowel followed by the sh sound is a template. So, whenever anything that is similar, they pronounce it in that way. So, fetch becomes fish and like that. Evidence for this has come from various languages like from Hebrew, Spanish, French, English, Estonian, Swedish and so on, where we see that they try to fit the same template for various new words that they learn, and that may lead to certain kinds of errors. So, thus the initial speech production we have looked at. Till now in this segment we have looked at only the very first stages of production, speech production. So, speech production there are two stages. The first stage will be producing the sounds and immediately followed by the production of words. So, these are the studies that we just looked at are the beginning of those word production, but more of it we will take up when we talk about word learning among infants in a different segment. So, this is till here we have talked about few theories as to how they probably segment. In the previous lecture we talked about how they how infants probably segment a continuous stream of speech into words and through the various kinds of theories, and then now we looked at how the speech production happens and what probably helps them. But this is a very rudimentary, very basic idea that we start with, but we will take it forward, we will carry this on with the in case of word learning in in another module. So, this is where we complete our module 3. Thank you very much. I will add all the references in the end, and you can look up all the more recent findings that either follow or do not fit the previous theories. So, that you have an updated understanding of how these theories hold today. Thank you.